Okay, so another really interesting question that someone submitted, they wanted to know some of the ways that labor law at the federal and state level fails to protect Black workers from exploitation, from wage theft, from poor working conditions. So let's talk about that for a bit. So when we're talking about labor law at the federal and at the state level, what's important to understand is indeed that there are levels to this. You have, say for example, a particular standard that applies at the federal level, nationally speaking. There is a minimum wage, for example, of $7.25. Unfortunately, still far too low. It's been that way for far too long, but that is the federal standard right now. That being said, many states and even some cities have implemented higher minimum wages that apply within that jurisdiction. So the people who live in those places get the benefits of a stricter and higher standard for what is acceptable for a worker and what is acceptable for a corporation to be able to do, as opposed to what is the case nationally. And what that also means is that for people who don't live in places where folks have been able to put together enough political power to push for higher standards, those folks kind of have to deal with what's left over by the federal government. As it so happens, many of those places are in the South, where the majority of Black folks in the U.S. still live. This is not a coincidence. The South has always run on an economic model of having cheap and exploitable labor and low labor standards going as far back as slavery. So there's an extent to which state and local labor law can be used to protect workers in a way that oftentimes the federal government doesn't, but it is important indeed to have a standard that can apply to as many people as possible, because many states and cities will not do things on their own to protect the workers that live there, because many of those economic models kind of rely on being able to exploit workers who work in particular industries and who very often happen to be Black and brown. Again, so what we have here is a range of state and local labor standards, and then underlying that, the federal labor standards. Great examples like the minimum wage, but we also have situations like workplace discrimination, where in certain states and localities, you might have a stricter set of protections against discrimination than the federal government provides. Now, what happens to folks who live in states and cities that haven't been able to amass the political power to be able to implement stricter regulations when the federal government starts to retrench? That's essentially what we're seeing happen right now, where the federal government is backing away from regulation, from both implementing new regulations and enforcing existing ones, and they're removing the funding from the agencies that are meant to enforce those regulations. This is a part of the Republican strategy to make it easier for corporations to exploit workers, to allow them to cut costs, and the impact of that is going to be felt most heavily in these states that haven't been able to put together those stricter sets of standards. Again, places in the South, places where Black workers in particular live and work. Seeing the federal government walk these things back is a great example of where these labor laws will start to fail Black workers even more.